today, just how many households are in real financial stress? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, our latest post covering finance and property news. Now, this show is an important one because it lays the foundation for my live event this coming Tuesday, where I'm going to discuss specifically the outcomes from our household financial stress analysis to the end of August. Given what's going on at the moment, specifically with high inflation hanging around and with interest rates still high, this is an important discussion. But of course, there's a broader question here which needs to be explored, which is just how many households are really under the gun. Now, this last week, we had a couple of other data points, and I'm going to explore those data points first, and then I'm going to touch on the high-level findings from my analysis ahead of the event on Tuesday. So first, I want to talk about the New South Wales Council of Social Services report called Impossible Choices, Decisions New South Wales Communities Shouldn't Have to Take. And it's focusing in on the cost of living in New South Wales in 2024. Now, it's worth noting the research, which was undertaken in March and April 2024, involves stratified random sampling to engage 1,086 New South Wales residents through an online survey. And the point I would make here is that's a very, very small sample, but is quite often the size that's used for sampling of households across the country on various aspects of this sort of analysis. Now, what they found was that if they looked across 2022, 23 and 24, the capacity of low-income households and those living below the poverty line to meet their essential living costs with their available incomes worsened year over year. In fact, they found over the past 12 months, 2/3, 65%, reported being unable to make a payment on an essential service at least once. And that increased by 5% from last year and 10% from 2022. There were sharper increases for specific items. For example, half of those surveyed said that they couldn't pay a utility bill in the last 12 months. That's an increase of 22% from 2022. And just about 3/4, 74% actually, reported going without an essential health and well-being item at least once because they were short of money. That's a relative increase of 6% from last year and 10% from 2022. And the year-on-year increase was larger for some essentials, for example, skipping a meal at least once. They also looked at housing, and they showed that expenditure on housing was most commonly ranked as the area that put the most pressure over the 12 months, around 30%. And the rates of housing stress remained high for many households living in low incomes or below the poverty line. More than 2/3 of households were in housing stress, defined as paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs. Now, that 30% is a concern, of course, because I've argued that that really doesn't give you a very good indicator. More than 1/4 of households were in extreme housing stress, spending more than half of their household incomes on housing costs. As a result of that, housing insecurity worsened, with 1 in 5 at 22% living in rentals who reported having their rental release terminated or not renewed by a landlord or property manager. That's up from 13% last year. And the percentage of households that reported having to move into public housing at 6% doubled compared with 2023. And in addition, homelessness increased by 40% relative to 2023 at 7%, up from 5% in 2023. And here is a bit of a summary of the most significant pressure areas. So household, food and non-alcoholic beverages, utilities, medical care and health expenses, insurance and financial services. And you can even see that things like education and childcare costs come but a long way down the list. So what are we to make of this? Well, of course, this is a very narrow sample, and it's focusing in specifically on households at the lower end of the income scale. But it is a fair representation of what's going on, and by the way, chimes quite nicely with my surveys, as we will see. But there was another discourse this week, which was also quite interesting, relating specifically to what's going on in households. And that was Michelle Bullock's speech titled The Costs of High Inflation. It got a lot of courage, actually, because she specifically said that some people will be forced to sell their properties. And I do encourage you to go and listen to her speech, because actually it was quite interesting, but also quite concerning. She made the point that inflation had shot up and goods and services was actually going in quite different directions. So we saw a significant inflationary impulse from the retail goods sector first, which is coming down, but market services, which includes things like insurance, financial services, and a bunch of other services too, where there are people involved, and also housing, which includes, of course, rental costs and also the costs of new housing construction, are still very high, and overall inflation is not necessarily going in the right direction. Just noting that the advertised rents and the CPI rents are still heading higher, and she made the point, of course, that rent prices don't necessarily chime with advertised rents because not everybody changes rents every month or every year. She did make the point also that the firms out there are still able to pass on significant costs. So while it's more difficult than it was, the fact of the matter is that there is still more inflationary pressures in the pipeline. And looking at the inflation trends long term, she made the point that way back in 1974, for example, inflation was very high and it sort of came down. It's now peaked up again. And she made the point that many people, of course, are not old enough to remember that earlier bout of inflation. The thing that she didn't talk about, which she should have at this point, was, of course, that the average mortgage is way bigger relative income than it was back then. So therefore, that creates an issue. And the cost of rents are way higher relative income now compared with where it was in 1974. So although inflation was even higher there, the impact on households probably wasn't as strong. She went to argue then that if you look at data from 21 and 2022, very old data now, of course, she showed that the higher quintile income households had more capacity to pay for what they needed to pay, whereas the lower quintiles had more difficulty. So their capacity to cover higher housing costs and other costs of living is much lower with lower incomes. Now, this data is very old, and that's because it's based on Hilda data, for example, which is 3 to 4 years out of date. And if you were to run that same analysis now, I think you'd have a rather different position. And finally, she showed that the borrowers with a cash flow shortfall, based on their calculations, stands at, well, just below 6%, maybe above 5%, and that the lower income quartiles were more highly represented than the other income quartiles. Now, you can see that there has been some growth. 2 points to make. This is information based off Hilda, so again, it's out of date, and also from the RBA securitization system. Now, the RBA securitization system picks up mortgages that are securitized, but mortgages that are securitized don't necessarily represent the full story. So there are some significant questions here about to what extent the RBA is looking at this more broadly. She does focus in on those mortgage holders, of course, because she argues that mortgage holders and financial stability become an important connection point. And she's arguing about 5% or more of those with a mortgage are in difficulty. Now, severe difficulty. The fact of the matter is, of course, that this is a quite late stage analysis in terms of when people get into difficulty. And I would argue that there are other ways of looking at this, such as I look at it, which would actually make a rather different outcome. But it does all depend on your definition of stressed. If you are actually just rejigging your finances and still keeping your head above water but cutting back, you probably wouldn't figure in this particular piece of analysis from the RBA, but you would be caught in my analysis. Which sort of takes us on then to, firstly, what Michelle Bullock said specifically, which was this.
I understand the board's message on interest rates is one that not many borrowers want to hear. Those with mortgages are feeling the squeeze on their cash flows, not just from high inflation, but also from the increase in interest rates that's occurred in response to it. And as labour market conditions ease, more households will experience a strain on their finance from unemployment or reduced working hours. Information received from the RBA's liaison program indicates that more people than usual are seeking support from community organisations, and often for the first time. In the FSR, we tend to focus on households with mortgages because debt has the potential to amplify and transmit stress across the financial system. A key point to make here is that despite the pressure on household budgets, only a small share of borrowers is currently at risk of falling behind on their mortgage repayments. The key reasons for this are that the labour market has been strong, people have been able to find and stay in work, and many have been making adjustments to their spending, particularly on discretionary items. For owner-occupiers with variable rate loans, which is a subset of all borrowers, we estimate that around 5% are in a particularly challenging situation, where the combined total of their essential spending and scheduled mortgage repayments is more than their income. That is, they have a cash flow shortfall. Now, although this group is fairly small overall, those in it have to make some quite painful adjustments to avoid falling behind on their mortgage repayments. This includes things like cutting back on their spending to the more essential items, trading down to lower quality goods and services, dipping into their savings or working extra hours. And some may ultimately have to make the very difficult choice to sell their home. A really important point to note here is that lower income borrowers are overrepresented in the group of people who are really struggling.
Now, that's a concern, of course. Some people will have to sell. I'm seeing that too, and I think we're going to see more of it ahead. So let's now move to my analysis, and this lays the foundation for my deep dive on Tuesday. Now, my household survey is 52,000 households, which is a big sample, and we update it each month. And we can slice and dice the data all sorts of different ways. It represents the households across the country, and it matches back to the ABS census. We can also take a view on where prices may go as well, based on our scenarios, but we're not going to touch on that today very deeply. But what we do look at is things like mortgage stress, the price trajectory of properties, the buying and selling intentions, the migration data, the income and economic data, CPI, wages, employment, those sorts of things. It goes into the core market model, and then we can run some analysis at a postcode level and roll it up to a region and state level and to all of Australia. And we can also form a view of where prices may go as a result of that at a granular level. Oh, and by the way, if you're interested in having a conversation with me about a particular locale, I do run my one-to-one service. It's highly popular at the moment, actually. And you can have an individual conversation with me. It's not financial advice, but I can do a deep dive on my data and look at the underlying trends. We can look at stress, home price trends data, and also form a view of price trends, and based on my modelling, form a view of what might be going to happen. You can book a phone or Zoom conversation up to an hour. There is a cost involved because there is a lot of work to do to put this together. It's quite a detailed report, 20 to 30 pages generally. And if you are interested, you can contact me via the DFA blog links below. We're booking 3 to 5 weeks ahead at the moment. Now, going back to the definition of stress, I mentioned the 30% of income from that New South Wales piece of analysis. I don't think that's a very good way of measuring it, so we define it in cash flow terms, money in, money out. Now, that means that if households have more outgoings, excluding one-off discretionary items than income, we define them as stressed. If they have a mortgage, they're in mortgage stress. If renting, they're in rental stress. Investors with cash flow pressures are identified as stressed investors, and we can aggregate the data to estimate the total financial stress. We can look at it in terms of percentages of households and also counts, and I've argued that percentages gives us one view, but I think the count gives us a better view because it's the law of big numbers. Now, earlier on, the RBA spoke again about the spectrum of household financial stress, and they made the point that at the mild end, people have initial budget pressures, and over time, people can slide into more difficult budget pressures, miss payments, and ultimately go insolvent. Now, where precisely the RBA is measuring their analysis in that earlier report is an interesting question. It seems to me roughly halfway along the trend there. But I'm measuring it right at the early end, at the mild end, where households have initial budget pressures. So with that out of the way, what is the latest data showing us? Well, to the end of August, firstly, rental stress remains very high at 76% of those in the rental sector So they have cash flow problems. I do make the point that the RBA doesn't very much focus on rental stress. They should, because of course a large proportion of households, as we'll see in a second, are in the rental sector, and it's a rising proportion. Then we can look at mortgage stress, and here we have just over half of households in mortgage stress, 50.1% actually. It dropped back slightly last month thanks to the different tax changes that came in and some of the other changes in the benefits that were being paid. More benefit pay changes, of course, are ahead as well. Compared that with February 2020, it was 32.9%. So you can see there's been quite a significant rise as interest rates have risen. And also make the point that the debt-to-income ratio still remains high, according to the RBA. They, of course, aggregate this across all households, so it is misstating the true effect of the debt-to-income ratios for mortgage holders, which is roughly, on average, about 6 times. So here is the data for August. And I've shown here in yellow where it's moved up from last month. So you can see there that there was a rise in mortgage stress in New South Wales, above 50%, a rise in Queensland, a rise in South Australia, and a rise in Western Australia to give the 50.1%. Looking at the rental stress, it was up in South Australia and Tasmania and Western Australia to 76.89%. The investor stress was up in Queensland, Victoria and Western Australia, and overall financial stress was up in New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Victoria, Western Australia, and up across the board. So 47% are in financial stress, which is more than 4.6 million households out of the nearly 10 million that exist. Now, looking in detail at the counts, there are 2.3 million households in rental stress, 1.8 million in mortgage stress on my definition, and a relatively small number of stressed investors, but still enough there to put pressure on some wanting to sell. We can also look at it by our different cohorts or segments, and you can see there that young growing families, and that includes a lot of first-time buyers, have the highest mortgage stress at 89%. That is about 281,000 households. The rental stress is highest amongst first-generation migrants, multicultural establishments I call them, at 85%, and that's more than 199,000 in rental stress. And then if we look at the overall financial stress, you can see there that young growing families are right at the top of the queue. I'll also make the point that looking at stressed investors, it's interesting that more affluent households, particularly exclusive professionals and young affluents, have the highest stress. That's because, of course, they've got a much higher proportion of properties in the investment portfolios they hold and are, in some cases, having some difficulty. Quickly now, if we just look at the top postcodes for mortgage stress, this is looking at the counts. Liverpool 2170 and Campbelltown 2560, both in New South Wales, are at the top. Then 6065, Tapping in Western Australia, Toowoomba in Queensland 4350, and then back to Camden 2570, Narre Warren in Victoria 3805, Roxburgh Park, Craigieburn, Donnybrook 3064, Pakenham 3810, Berwick and Harkaway 3806, and then regional centres like Ballarat 3350, and then back to others like Tarnit and Cranbourne in Victoria, Riverson in New South Wales, and Pine Mountain in Queensland. If we look at rental stress, the highest count is in the centre of Melbourne, postcode 3000, then Toowoomba 4350, then Liverpool 2170, Westmead 2145, Labrador in Queensland 4215, Campbelltown 2560, Coomera in Queensland 4209, Tarnit 3029 in Victoria, Derrimont 3030, Zetland in New South Wales, Bundaberg in Queensland 4670, Ipswich in Queensland 4305, Cranbourne in Victoria 3977, Mount Druitt in New South Wales 2770, Yatala in Queensland 4207, and Blacktown in New South Wales at 2148. And overall financial stress, the postcode with the highest pressure is in Toowoomba 4350, with more than 27,000 households in financial stress. Then Liverpool 2170, Campbelltown 2560, Cranbourne 3977, Tarnit in Victoria 3029, Derrimont 3030, Roxburgh Park in Victoria 3064, Centre of Melbourne 3000, Ballarat 3350, so the interesting cluster there in Victoria. Westmead in New South Wales 2145, Ipswich in Queensland 4305, Mount Druitt in New South Wales 2770, Camden in New South Wales 2570, and then Sampson in Western Australia, Belbird Park in Queensland, Pakenham in Victoria, Blacktown in New South Wales, and Upper Coomera in Queensland 4209. So you can see here that there is significant financial pressure on my measure. I say I'm measuring it much earlier than the RBA, but I do think it's important to understand that this financial pressure is building not just among mortgage holders, but among other households too. But unfortunately, we're also seeing more mortgage holders in more difficulty. Now, on Tuesday, I'm going to go into this in more detail. I'm going to highlight specifically some of those postcodes and also look at the data below that. And in fact, if you come in and join the program live, you can ask for data on a particular postcode and we can look at it in much more granular detail. And here is an example of the data as we display it. And we look at things like the number of households, the portion in stress, the property mix, the gross and net investment yields, the disposable monthly income, and even some trends in terms of price trajectory. Before I go, let me just also make the final point that if you are in financial difficulty, it's important to reach for help early and be careful not to Google it, but actually go to a recognized source of help. The National Debt Helpline on 1-800-007-007 is an excellent government-backed source of help. They are very busy. They've had significant rises in the number of calls, but that's a good source of help if you need it. And the other source, which is quite interesting, is to look at AFCA. AFCA has a statement of financial position tool, and there you can actually work out where you are financially. A lot of households don't do this. Very important you do. You need to know, of course, what you earn, what you owe, what your living expenses are, and what you own. And the electronic form there can be saved as a PDF. And that makes it easier then to talk to a financial counsellor or financial advisor. And finally, let me just say that you can support what we do via Patreon. There are the various tiers, but I'll highlight particularly the $50 US tier, where if you want to get hold of the more than 2,000 postcode detailed data sets that we hold, you can subscribe and get that. I'll be sending that out after the live show on Tuesday to those who are subscribed. And if you'd like to join the subscription, feel free to go across to Patreon again. The links are below. But the bottom line is this, that when you see a particular set of analysis trying to define how many households are hit, you need to understand the basis of the analysis in the first place. What sampling did they use? What method did they use? Secondly, you need to understand their definitions, because quite often the definitions that they use are a bit weaselly. And in some cases, it's deliberately designed to make things sound less bad than it actually is, I think. And third, and very importantly, I think it's important to look at trends. So look at what's happened over the last few years, because we can then perhaps project forward where things may be going later. And quite often, point in time analysis doesn't give you the full story. So mark your diary, 8 p.m. Sydney next Tuesday, and I'll be there to go through the detailed analysis that we've done, go through some of the postcodes, and talk more broadly about how this plays out in the years and months ahead. But the bottom line for me is that more and more households are up against it as inflation stays high, and with the RBA pretty much promising that rate cuts won't be coming until next year, this is going to be a significant pressure on many households. Inflation, of course, is indeed hitting all households, as the Reserve Bank Governor says, but unfortunately, those with more limited cash flow are definitely in the front line. Now, if you're buying your home in Sydney's contentious market, you don't need to stand alone. This is the time you need to have Edwin Almeida from Ribbon Property Consultants standing alongside you. Buying a property is both challenging and adversarial. The vendor has a professional on their side. Emotions run high, price discovery and price transparency are hard to find, and then there's the wasted time and financial investments that you make. Edwin understands your needs, so why not engage a licensed professional to stand alongside you? With RPC, you know you have experience, knowledge,
and master negotiators, looking after your best interests. So shoot Ribbon an email at info@ribbonproperty.com.au, and if you use the promo code DFAWTW/Martin, you can get a 10% discount offer.
I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.